Thank you for the invitation to speak here tonight. It's really an honor to be talking to NACIS, and we really appreciate your interest in our work. It's really heartening to be here. Bobby, can you see us and hear us okay?
I can see you and hear you. Can you see the presentation?
We can.
All right.
Okay, cool.
It's working.
It's a good way to start a conference when everything's working, so that's awesome. Bobby and I are going to give you an overview of our story, Land Grab University, as well as the practical uses for the platforms that we've built around this particular investigation. A reminder is, if you like, we use the hashtag LandGrabU to help aggregate stories, hot takes, etc. online. You're welcome to do so as well if you like. And we're going to talk about the Morrill Act and how to use the data that we collected and look at how institutions have started engaging with this investigation since it came out almost 2 years ago now, and how it's continued. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation. And the story that we've learned around the Morrill Act is that land-grant universities were given the gift of free land to bring education to the masses. But as our investigation at High Country News reveals, the Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. In all, the Act redistributed nearly 10.8 million acres of land from more than 250 tribal nations for the benefit of 52 colleges. But the Morrill Act's footprint is broken up into almost 80,000 parcels of land scattered across 24 states, making research and reporting on its impacts nearly impossible. But through our 2-year investigation, we've been able to identify and map those 80,000 individual land parcels to better understand the relationship between higher education and violent colonialism. Combined, those scattered parcels represent an area approximately the size of Denmark, and our reporting kind of provides a window into how universities profited from dispossession and genocide. It also offers opportunities for additional reporting, research, and collaboration to further the investigative work that this project has kicked off. And we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail, but first, I'll turn the mic over to Bobby to talk more about the Morrill Act and how this project came to be.
All right. Thank you, Tristan. Thank you for having us, first of all, for the introduction, and thank you to Pat and the other organizers for putting this hybrid keynote together. And thanks to all of you for coming, both in person and online. The Land Grab Universities project really is about the power of maps, so we're excited to be talking with you today about it. What I'd like to do is give you some background on the project and provide some additional detail on the Morrill Act of 1862 and our approach to investigating it. Now, the indigenous sources of university land has been a major emerging issue in the last 5 years or so, and it came out of studies of slavery in the university that many of you might have seen. And it sort of eased into, I would say, our sort of collective consciousness. In 2014, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, sort of flagged the issue just in a sentence. Cultural theorists like K. Wayne Yang started discussing it from the perspective of decolonizing the university. More recently, there were important articles by scholars like Sharon Stein and Margaret Nash, who started framing the Morrill Act of 1862 as settler colonial legislation that took from indigenous nations to expand agricultural and mechanical education for settlers. And they've started to unpack how that worked. Now, meanwhile, there was a cartographic side to this developing as well. There were a few researchers at places like UMass and Virginia Tech that started to try to map the Morrill Act footprint of individual land-grant colleges and to connect them to indigenous nations. But these efforts were small, and they apparently hit some snags, and neither of them were complete. There were also some efforts at schools like the University of Iowa, at Michigan State, at the University of Nebraska, to begin mapping their Morrill Act parcels, but they weren't thinking in terms of identifying the land's original owners and caretakers. Now, these early efforts made three things quite clear, I think. First of all, it made clear that we had the theoretical tools to rethink the foundations of land-grant universities, and we're really primed to use them. I don't think I've spoken to anyone about this project who didn't immediately understand the issue. It's like throwing a light switch. Of course, the land and land-grant universities had to come from somewhere, and it's not particularly surprising that it came from Indigenous dispossession, which was the fundamental act at the heart of North American colonization. Now, second of all, and particularly pertinent to NACIS, is this early work made clear that we had the tools, the methodological tools, to turn a general sense of this issue into a concrete body of actionable and empirical knowledge, and that these tools were fundamentally cartographic. If you could obtain historical data about the location of land-grant university parcels, you could build a geodatabase that would use simple functions in digital spatial analysis, things like overlay analysis, to match specific land-grant university parcels to specific instances of Indigenous dispossession. And using those same tools, you could also visualize these complex connections in really compact, dynamic, and static maps. And third, what the early work made clear was that the time was right, that by and large, the question of how land-grant universities were built with Indigenous land had been almost entirely neglected in the scholarship and public memory of land-grant universities themselves. So this is where the High Country News collaboration comes in. We got started in 2018 when Tristan and I were on fellowships at the same university. This was really fortunate because I'm a historian, he's a journalist, and we otherwise would be running in different circles. And the project we developed was a disciplinary hybrid. It would combine historical research with spatial analysis and cartography and investigative journalism and bundle them into a multimedia report designed to communicate our findings, support ongoing research, and draw attention to the living legacy of colonialism and genocide baked into the foundations of land-grant universities. So before I tell you a little bit more about the investigation's results, let me give you a sort of quick sketch, some of the background on the Morrill Act itself and about land-grant colleges. Land-grant colleges, giving land to endow colleges, began earlier than the 1862 Morrill Act. In the United States, you find these types of grants as early as 1803 with a college in Mississippi. There are state colleges that get these grants in the antebellum period. If you go back into the colonial era, there are grants in this period as well. What happens in 1862 is this land grant idea gets nationalized. It's turned into a national program that's going to be used all across the United States. And the idea behind it was social uplift for the white majority, expanding education for the agricultural and industrial classes by providing practical knowledge in the agricultural arts and mechanical sciences. The literature that emerged to study the Morrill Act couched these institutions. It described them as democracy's colleges. This is the phrase that you see all over the literature. And the work by historians had tried to sort of evaluate to what extent land-grant colleges were able to realize that idea. They weren't asking about the indigenous sources of the land and the funding that enabled these universities to take off. And finally, the Morrill Act of 1862 comes at a time when there is dynamic redistribution of expropriated indigenous land from the public domain of the United States. In 1862, you're in the middle of the Civil War, or towards the beginning, and you have three landmark land laws, all of which deserve the attention of cartographers. You have the Homestead Act of 1862 that gives away homesteads to individuals who will live on the land for 5 years and then get title to it for nothing. Then you have the Pacific Railroad Act, which gives out these checkerboard-shaped grants around the transcontinental railroads to help them fund building these railroads. And in 1862, you also, a couple of days after the Pacific Railroad Act, you have the Morrill Act of 1862. These are sort of the big three land laws, but there are three of thousands, I should add, in the 19th century. So how does this work? How does the Morrill Act of 1862 actually redistribute indigenous land? So here's a step-by-step guide. It's not meant to be read, so at this scale, so don't focus on the details. But I should say that the graphics and the maps that you're going to see in this presentation, they were made by Margaret Pierce, the cartographer for the project. So this appears in the magazine article, and it's sort of it goes through how the Morrill Act works. First, Congress offers participation in the act to the states, and they have to accept. Second, there's the land. Some of this land had already been acquired from indigenous nations, and some is going to be acquired in the future. The third point here is about the size of the grants. These are not uniform grants. They range in size from 90,000 acres to 990,000 acres, so almost 1 million acres. And that depends, the amount of land that a state gets for their university depends on the size of their congressional delegation, which is a proxy for population. So New York gets the largest grant, nearly 1 million acres. It's the most populous state in the 1860 census. These parcels are going to range in size from, less than an acre to more than 800 acres. The fourth point here I'll go into in a minute. It's about the way the land is selected. And then the final point here is about disposal. This land has to be sold. Some of the states are going to sell it off in blocks to speculators. Others are going to hold on to it and sell it off over time, opening up real estate offices. Sometimes they're embedded within the universities themselves. But let me show you a little bit more about this fourth point. The two main ways in which the land itself was selected by the states for the universities. Basically, there was an eastern-western split. So states in the east, where there wasn't public domain land or there wasn't much public domain land left, so places like New York, you see Cornell here on the right, they got something called scrip in the 19th century. These are basically coupons that say you can select 160 acres anywhere on the public domain. So they get whatever their block of acreage is in these 160 acre scrip pieces, and they can sell those off to speculators, and that's what they do. And then this land can be snapped up anywhere in the public domain. So Cornell's grant winds up being spread, its redemption winds up being spread across many states across the West. Western states that had a lot of public domain land within their borders. So on the left here, you see the University of California. They had to select land from within their state's boundaries, and they tended to hold on to it for longer, sell it out over years, and run these real estate businesses. What you see here are some of the statistics that you can start to aggregate when you collect this data at scale about the sort of totality of each one of these grants. But what does it look like when you get down to the ground level? Here is a Tucson, Arizona, a square mile parcel that was seized from the Apache, the Western bands, came into U.S. possession in 1886 for nothing was paid for title. And it was redistributed for the benefit of University of Arizona's endowment. And you can see how precisely we can map these. I'm sure a lot of you in the audience are familiar with the PLSS. This is embedded within the larger public land system. These square parcels right here. This is a square mile. You can see in the middle a football field, a baseball diamond, tract housing. And if you get right down to the ground, you can see in this parcel a roadside motel, the Apache Tears Motel. This photograph and the other photographs in the story were all taken by Kalen Goodluck, who made a sort of tour of the West, going to these parcels with using his phone and our geolocation of the parcels to see what was there on the ground. And when you put it all together, sort of, this is what it was about. The main map, the big map, the High Country News collaboration at root was about finding all of these pieces, all of these parcels, and putting them into a composite whole to see the geographic footprint of the Morrill Act of 1862 and to be able to analyze it in relationship to Indigenous, to Indigenous dispossession. And that's what you're seeing on this map here. We didn't just want to look at one university or one state. The project's goal was to unspool the knot of the Morrill Act completely, to get every piece, to locate all of these parcels insofar as it was possible, and to track down the Indigenous origins of each one of them in order to gain a sense of the enormity of the wealth transfer that the Morrill Act entailed. And that's really at the analytical core of this project, understanding the Morrill Act not as a donation, not as a federal donation, but as a wealth transfer from Indigenous people through the infrastructure of the state to land grant universities to build up their endowments. And this map is the result of the investigation in its most condensed and compact form. So the Morrill Act of 1862, we found, gave away roughly 10.8 million acres to 47 states, which sold and leased the land and funneled the endowments that were raised to 52 universities. Most of these universities were public. Some of them were private, like MIT or Cornell. And the land itself came from nearly 250 tribes and nations whose land was claimed by the U.S. through 162 treaties. Some of these are ratified, some of them are unratified, some of them are outright land takings, executive orders. And when you look at how much was paid, it amounts to roughly $400,000 was paid for what was called Indian title in the 19th century. And out of that land, nearly $23 million was raised. So I should say that for many of these parcels, nothing was paid at all. This is particularly the case in California. But the ratio of monies paid through treaties to monies raised for endowments was 57 to 1. For every dollar spent to extinguish Indian title, $57 was dropped into the coffers of the endowments of land grant universities. Now, when we sort of do the math and figure out what this is in contemporary dollars, we're looking at endowments worth about $500 million in today's money. And this is endowment principal. This is before it goes to work earning interest to help the schools run. And what you see here are these nearly 80,000 parcels spread across 24 states, and the means to compare them through these pull lines that you see here, looking at the Chippewa Treaty of 1837, which later became the source for more than 1 million acres redistributed for the benefit of 33 land grant universities. It raised $3.2 million and cost the U.S. less than $65,000. There's Gage County, Nebraska on here, which was among the most densely covered counties in the United States with Morrill Act parcels, and the land came entirely from the Kaw Nation of Kansas. In California, the pullout here, you see the land cession, the Indigenous land cession that had the highest percentage of Morrill Act parcels. It's near the site of the Mariposa War during the California genocide. And what you can do with this approach is reconnect histories of dispossession to histories of land redistribution in order to move from an abstract understanding of universities as beneficiaries of conquest to the ability to tie specific institutions to specific tribal nations. So now let me hand it back to Tristan, and he'll tell you about the project's online tools.
So one of the things that we wanted to do with this project was make our data available to anybody who wanted to do any additional reporting or research or even fact check any of our findings. So if you're not comfortable using spreadsheets, if you're not a heavy data user, we wanted to make sure that you still had access to everything that we were working with, and in a clear and user-friendly way. So on landgrabu.org here, you have access to the same data with the same level of accuracy, and you can explore all of it through interactive maps. So university pages here like Cornell's, it gives you a lot of information: founding date, student enrollment, how many acres it received, but most importantly, you can play with the map that we put together. So Jeff McGee and Cody Leff developed this site and these maps. And what it allows you to do is see the connections between the institution and the land. So you can zoom in, you can get really, really detailed all the way down to the acre. You can fly through, even locate yourself on the map. You'll see there the crosshairs will allow you to, the map to find you if that's what you'd like to do. See if you live on one of these parcels. As our developer Jeff McGee found out during the reporting process. You also have the opportunity to check addresses, so that search function at the bottom right of the screen gives you the opportunity to check an address, see if it's on a parcel, or even what land cession it is. As you can see on the side there, you can click on the links, you can click on the actual Indigenous land cessions, current state boundaries, satellite map, etc. These are obviously invaluable for a number of applications in terms of land cessions outside of even just this project. This data layer gives you a lot of stuff that you can play with very, very quickly through here. You can really spend as much time as you like exploring the data. And if you go to the next slide here, next one right after this, you'll see the University of California. And zoomed out, you can see all the connections the university has to Morrill Act lands. And if you go to the next slide and you zoom in a little bit, this is a view of Los Angeles. And you can see the actual parcels and the boundaries that we've extracted from the primary documents. And with each one of these parcels, essentially what Cody and Jeff have done is create a web page for each and every one of them. So it's thousands of pages that you can get an incredible amount of information from acre by acre, state by state, university by university. And here on the page that's on the screen, you can see how that this is the University of California. When it was acquired, the federal government signed a treaty with 10 tribes for this piece of land, but paid no money for it. You can see that the University of California sold it for $786.74. By the way, if you're wondering why there's a treaty but no payment, it's because the United States refused to ratify those treaties. So settlers got the land and the tribes were removed or exterminated. So just with this page, you can start to construct a story about this very specific piece of land. And because the site also works on mobile, you can actually go there. So by locating yourself on your phone and traveling to that actual parcel is what our photographer Kaylin Goodluck did. And as you can see here, this is how we know that parcel and that information you saw on the previous screen is actually home to the Directors Guild of America. If you go to the next slide, you can see that by going to the actual parcel, that this is the Fort Lawton Post Cemetery in Seattle. It was once Duwamish and Suquamish land. It was ceded by treaty in 1855 for the benefit of Clemson University and South Carolina State. Despite negotiating this treaty with the federal government, the Duwamish are still unrecognized and continue to advocate for their rights guaranteed under federal law. And this land was sold for about $4, while the universities raised about $58 from its sale. If you go to the next slide, it's also how we found these cornfields that you saw earlier on our splash page. It was acquired from the Kansas tribe for $24.32 and sold by Ohio State for $1,784.31. And finally, you can see on this land in El Rosa, Minnesota, it was taken from the Dakota and sold by the University of Minnesota for nearly $1,000. And as you can see, it's now a scrapyard. So these are just a few of Kaylin's photos. They're haunting, they're beautiful, but we were only able to snap about 24 or so because there are obviously a lot of places to travel around the U.S. But using the app, should you want to, you can do the same. And I encourage you to do so, to visit a parcel, see what's there, and really think about that history and what that might actually inspire in you when you're at that spot. And again, you're seeing here, there's still a lot more work to be done. Last summer, we reported at least 16 land-grant universities, which are nearly a third of the schools in the system, still retain more than 500,000 acres that were obtained through the Morrill Act that brought in at least $8.7 million in revenue combined for fiscal year 2019 alone. Utah State is a good example. The school collected more than $1 million in fiscal year 2019 from a remaining 28,000 surface acres and 52,000 mineral acres that were obtained through the Morrill Act. And when I say there's more work to be done here, it's important to keep in mind that we only collected data on fiscal year 2019. So the cumulative revenue from acquisition to present at these institutions is completely unknown. So it's really open for you to report, to localize, and that data and all of its stories data is available for you to download on GitHub. And Dr. Lee will explain how you can do that.
Yeah, thanks. This is the point. Struggle a little bit to keep people's attention, but I think for a NACIS group, talking about the data and its availability might be the most exciting part of the presentation. I mean, one of the main goals of this project was to make everything open source. So all of the data we collected, make it available to the public to build on. There were sort of 3 levels of curation in the project. There is the story in High Country News, the magazine article, where we guide readers through the findings. We talk about what the Morrill Act is, and we pull out some of those stories. But there are so many stories to tell here that we couldn't capture them all. So we provide the landgrabu.org site where you can sort of choose your own adventure through the data and use the preset tools to build your own dynamic maps and pull out statistics, find places, use it on your phone in a dynamic way. But it's still guided by our choices, you know, in designing the site. The most freedom comes at this level of the project, the open source data set on GitHub that you can download yourself. I mean, this is just the GitHub page. There is also a user guide that we wrote up that describes what all the fields are. These types of processes would be very familiar, I'm sure, to all of you in the room. You know, shape files, CSVs, you know, linking attributes to their polygons. That is the design of the geodatabase. It's very easy to use, and it allows you to make your own maps quickly and easily without having to reinvent the wheel to reconstruct this data set that we dug out of a combination of digital archives and paper archives at the National Archives and BLM repositories and universities. When you open it up, you know, this is it in Excel on my desktop. The main spreadsheet is just, you know, the 80,000 parcels, the 80,000 rows of data. And there's much more data here than appears in the story or even appears on the website. There are links to the BLM. There are the names of the patentees. There are avenues to build out this research and to visualize it in new and inventive ways, and to use those tools to follow and find new stories. Because really the work that we did in this project is really just sort of the tip of the iceberg on this issue. So I encourage all of you not just to visit the website, but to go through to the GitHub page, download this, and start playing with it. You know, throw some maps up on the web. It's all open source. But let me hand it back to Tristan to tell you a little bit about the impact that the work has been having in the almost 2 years since we've published.
Yeah, so Land Grab Universities has started a public conversation on the debts that these institutions owe to Indigenous communities that we think are going to continue long into the future. And one big area that I'll look at here is in terms of coverage and reporting. The three areas that we've really seen reporters play in when it comes to taking on this story has been sort of localizing, contextualizing, and adapting. So you'll see here from Ione, Ohio, the investigative news outlet in Ohio. It mapped all the lands that supported Ohio schools using the publicly available data. It's a great example of how reporters in one state could just provide detailed, localized analysis of the information in just a quick map that they threw together. Then there was Vox Magazine. It's produced by journalism students at the University of Missouri. And Vox looks specifically at Mizzou's footprint and relationship with the indigenous communities it received land from, which were the Osage. So using some really simple timelines, reporters added context to the data, revealing that through either miscommunication or deceptive practices, the Osage ceded all of their land to the federal government and were forced to move here to Oklahoma, making that land available for the University of Missouri. And then finally, there are stories that kind of go beyond the data that we collected that instead utilize Dr. Lee's methodology here. So in September of last year, Scallywag magazine revealed that Southern universities funded their early years through the sale of land expropriated from indigenous communities. So the University of North Carolina, which you can see on this map, took more than 200,000 acres of Cherokee and Chickasaw lands that were also gained through indigenous removal. They also found that more than 30% of UNC's annual budget was comprised of land sales between 1818 and 1840, well before the Morrill Act became law. So these are some of the ways in which people are engaging with the data and in the information. Some folks are just using what we've got on GitHub and pulling it down for their own use. And other folks are sort of running with the idea in other directions to sort of see what else can we apply this sort of thinking to, as Scallywag has. And then there's what's happening at the institutions, and Bobby, I'll let you take that.
All right, yeah, in terms of institutional change, it has been very exciting to see. We started to see movement really immediately with the reporting. And like the journalism that Tristan just highlighted, we see each university is sort of handling this information in different ways, but we see a lot of sort of grassroots organizing from students, from faculty, starting to engage with this issue at their own schools. So almost directly after publication, what you're looking at here is the University of Florida Student Senate. This is a resolution that they put out demanding the assembly of a working group to examine the University of Florida's connections to indigenous expropriation and slavery in order to better understand and document the university's history. We've seen other student groups at places like Cornell and MIT put out other demands that are starting to get some traction. We've also seen similar moves at Washington State University, which was the first to rewrite its land grant university land acknowledgement. And it pledged to organize a commission to team up to determine and think about what reconciliation plans might look like. Now, what they did here in their acknowledgement was they integrated the data from the website into their acknowledgement. We're seeing similar moves at Texas A&M, which is working toward assembling a task force to better understand the history of the Morrill Act on their institutional development, as well as its impacts on indigenous communities. Another response we've seen are conferences and teach-ins. At UC Berkeley, for example, students and staff and faculty held a 2-day symposium to explore and address the university's responsibility to indigenous communities in California. The meeting included nearly 24 speakers. There were breakout sessions to deal with calls, to think about calls to action, to think about inspiration for accountability, and looking at different ways to analyze the school's history with the Morrill Act. particularly around issues of raising issues of land returns and the mechanics through which that might happen. Looking at how other cities or states or churches or federal government had engaged in those types of activities. Then there were places like Cornell, which is the largest Morrill Act beneficiary, as I mentioned earlier, the one that earned the most money from its Morrill Act endowment by far. And there, staff and faculty took another step. They launched a project to document the university's financial windfall through a regularly updated and dedicated site that's getting stuff added to it regularly. The goal here is to present as much factual information about Cornell's parcels and to determine and consult with tribes impacted by Cornell's history with the Morrill Act of 1862, and to think through and determine possible remedies. A similar project has really just taken off. Really starting this month, they had their opening event at Ohio State, the Stepping Out and Stepping Up Truth and Reconciliation Project at Ohio State, which is really taking major steps to address this history. Perhaps it's one of the most robust programs that we've seen in response to the reporting. Now, their goal here is to think about a restitution plan and rewriting their land acknowledgement and really engaging with and bringing impacted tribes to the table to discuss what a future for Ohio State recognizing this history will look like. There's a similar project that's launching really, tomorrow. We're going to be digitally in Connecticut at the University of Connecticut, which has started a land grab Yukon project, which is engaging in similar work, and that is a student organized project that has taken on a life within the university. It's really very exciting to see. But really, these are just a handful of some of the major moves that we've been seeing since publication. Each one, I think, speaks to the unique characteristics of the communities involved. There's not really a one-size-fits-all approach here to handling this information or taking steps to move forward, but there's a common theme with small groups of individuals who are interested in seeing this history recognized and acknowledged and acted on by their institutions, taking steps to realize that and making it happen. So that's an overview of the Land Grab Universities project. We are excited to be here with you talking about it, and we are happy to take any questions that you might have in the time that we have left remaining. Thanks very much.
Thank you both so much. And we started a little late, so if you don't mind having a few extra minutes for questions so we can get those. I have one remote one that I'll ask, and then I'm going to go find a microphone that I realize that I need to get you all to be able to ask as well. So Haley Lou Rogers asked, are there other modern day institutions that were land granted in similar ways? I have always heard the term land grant universities, but I did not understand how that process worked.
I'll let you take that, Bobby. Your face is very big. It's fantastic.
Yeah, the short answer is there are both. There are colleges across the colonial period. There are, importantly, schools. Most public schools in the American West get some kind of funding out of land endowments that were funneled to the states in the 19th century. These were the 16th section of the township. So a township has 36 sections, generally the 16th, and then later on in the 19th century, they were giving 2 of these townships in the more arid states, and then they were using those to build state funds in order to help run public schools. So it's not just college; it's K through 12, K through 14, or 16, or however high it goes. And then there are other state institutions that also benefited from land. I mean, we can think about these along a spectrum from like from private to public, right? I mean, there are the railroads that were privately owned that got this public land to build up these institutions that were meant to help develop the state. There were things like canals and wagon roads that had a sort of public-private dimension. You know, sometimes they were built by the state versus private entities. There were hospitals, things like miners' hospitals in the 19th century that states developed, and then those developed over time. They became things like nursing homes for the elderly. There were orphanages in the 18th century and the 19th century that benefited from land grants. You often have to dig through the records of in the colonial period to find these sort of individual grants, but they are there. One of the most interesting to me actually is one that Yale University received. Yale University had a land grant waiting for it before it existed. There was a colonial grant that it issued for the future college of the state of Connecticut. So there are a whole wide range of institutions that are developed with land. I'm working on this problem. It's a very big problem. It starts from the very beginning of North American colonization, and it goes through today. You can still acquire, if you are a certain type of organization, for example, a historical organization that is doing some type of historical preservation. There are avenues to acquire land at no cost from the federal government out of federal lands. So this still exists as a possibility, and it's still ongoing. It's never stopped. And the land, of course, is still here. As Tristan was mentioning, it's sometimes still in the hands of the state for things like land grant universities. So yes, is the short answer, and there's a much bigger answer that's still waiting to be worked on.
Thank you. I have another virtual question, and then if anyone has questions in person, raise your hand, and then when I call on you, you have to speak loudly because there's no other mic, and then I'll just repeat it for this, if that's okay. And we can take, I think 3 more questions, and this one counts as one. Was the Morrill Act and its transfer of Indigenous lands to create more universities also envisioned as a way to assimilate Indigenous people into European agricultural lifestyles as well as benefit white people? And that's from Corwin Grow.
Oh.
You
can start.
I have not seen anything to that effect, that they were sort of directly tied in that way. There is a whole other side of sort of agricultural education, it's not the same as what's happening through the Morrill Act, which is trying to get scientific agriculture into colleges along the sort of the model of what you would think of as the collegiate model. There is a whole other side to attempts at assimilation that are associated with providing things like farming instruments in articles of treaties and things like that. But those are separate projects. I mean, one of the things that we see here, and you can see in the landgrabu.org site, is even today the paucity of Indigenous students that are at land grant universities.
I mean, I guess I would add here too is that these institutions weren't built for anybody but white men when they were created. So, I think that in the United States sort of expansion across the West here, Indigenous people were not factored into the future of the United States with the expectation that people would be killed off, more or less. I mean, Native Americans weren't made citizens, and I use the word made citizens of the U.S. until 1924. That's not really all that long ago. And most of that sort of assimilation process is happening on the back end after warfare or treaties or anything else aren't successful in sort of eliminating tribal nations.
Yeah. Have any of the universities or institutes began the process of giving land back?
There's a discussion at a number of places, but I think, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Bobby, but Ohio seems like it's probably the closest to even getting to that point, because that's the only school where administration is actually involved. We've heard, obviously, there have been talks about how that would work, like the University of California conference, or there's been discussion out of Wisconsin, for instance, about land swap, of not being able to return that land, but being able to swap back land the university already owns. So it differs from place to place, but it obviously is a conversation on the table. I think it seems to me that the closest that we're at right now in terms of any major institutional changes are free tuition for Native students, which seems like it's probably going to be happening within the next 5 or so years. But land returns, as you know, is a much more complicated process. And I think you can see that a lot in terms of land acknowledgments from universities, for instance, that say we occupy the unceded lands of so-and-so. It's kind of easy to say, if you're a member of that tribe, you can say, well, you could give it back. But it's not going to happen just yet.
Yeah, Tristan mentioned in the presentation the 500 or so thousand acres that are still retained from the Morrill Act. I mean, these are acres that were selected originally and are the land that was taken to fund these universities. These universities are mostly in the far west, in the Mountain West. They include places like South Dakota State University, which was one of the earliest to act and to rethink its Morrill Act history. Before we were working on this story, we discussed them in the High Country News article. But their mode has been holding the lands and redirecting the funds. There has been no movement among universities that still have the land to think seriously about how they might return that. And that type of work would have to flow through the state legislatures, which in many of these states would be extremely, there would be quite a bit of resistance.
Thank you so much for answering that and for your responses as well. I actually think I need to close the questions just to make sure that we can get to the map gallery since we're 10 minutes over. Thank you everyone for listening and everyone virtually who attended. And again, thank you both.